This is Edward Polsue for WarGen on the 15th of August 2018. I'm with Mrs. Julienne Knight and Mr. Bob Knight at their house in Dorking. Mrs. Julienne Knight is going to talk to me about her experiences at the Santo Tomas Internment camp during the Second World War in Manila. So, when we're ready, could you just, for the sake of the edit, just state your name and a brief sort of introduction about what happened to you during the Second World War?
My maiden name was Jefferson, and I went to the Philippines as a very young child because my father was building or instructing the building of the totalizator in the racetrack in Manila. It was an Australian invention, and that's what took us to the Philippines.
Could I say, her father was an engineer who was posted to Manila to install excuse me, the totalization machine in the racetrack in Manila, and they went there in 1937.
37,
yes.
yes. 1937
from Australia.
From Australia?
Yes. From
so you're Australian by
Australian
birth? Okay,
by birth,
okay.
yes. And my parents enjoyed the life there so much so that we stayed on. And therefore we were caught when the Japanese invaded the Philippines after Pearl Harbor. And it was very soon after Pearl Harbor. My father was listening to the BBC and thought we had been living in a house on the harbour, and he looking out and seeing all the ships that were there, plus the airport, the Air Force airport, was not terribly far to the south of where we lived, and he thought that it was better for us to get away from that particular area. And I don't know how it was arranged, but we transported things to live with to a new suburb of Manila. And how they got into this house, I do not know. But as the Japanese were bombing, I used to be... I spent my time with my mother under the stairs in a cupboard where she read the Wizard of Oz books to me, just to take my mind off whatever it was that was happening. And then one evening, my father realized that looking towards Manila, there was an amazing, it wasn't a sunset, it was Manila burning, petrol dumps or whatever it was. And he said, we're too isolated out here, we're going back to Manila itself. And how they arranged accommodation for us, I do not know, but we put the mattress on the top of the car, and all the chickens that my mother had thought might be useful, and rushed back to Manila and went into a townhouse, again facing the boulevard on the lake, on the Manila Bay. Mm-hmm. But it was there when I don't know how long we were there, but it wasn't until, I believe, March that the Japanese rounded up all the civilians who were taken off to Santo Tomas.
I think it's worth saying, that in the period up to the Japanese invasion of the Philippine Islands, there were strong rumours within the expatriate community that war was inevitable, and your relations in Australia did in fact suggest to your parents that they should leave Manila because of the likelihood of war.
Right.
And this feeling of the inevitability of war was fairly general throughout the expatriate community, principally the American community in the Philippine Islands. But it was felt that there was a man called MacArthur there was the American Army there was the American Air Force there,
Yes.
and that any threat from the Japanese could be more than well countered by the numbers of American troops defending the Philippine Islands.
It's like the Repulse and the Prince of Wales and all the rest of it, and further towards
Yes.
China.
Yes.
But
There was also the fact, I think, that life was very comfortable for
Yeah.
people in pre-war Manila. I mean, it was an extremely comfortable expatriate life.
yeah,
They all had servants. They all had clubs to go to. Parties abounded. Life was very good, and a lot of people, I think, felt
It can't happen to us.
unwilling
Yeah.
to sort of give this up
yeah,
against the possibility
yes,
of war. And of course, how wrong they were.
yeah. Do you remember your childhood being idyllic and running around?
Yes, being right on the edge of the boulevard. My life was eventually going to school when I was 6, but going out and playing with other children with their armours, looking after them, and then we'd be brought back for meals and things like that.
Like Empire of the Sun.
Exactly.
Yeah,
yes,
sort of,
yes. And trips. My father loved driving and seeing more of the actual island, and we had many a trip, say to Baguio, which is up in the mountains, and yes.
And you had lots of school friends, and
yes, the English, not exactly the English community, it was more American.
More the
Yes.
Americans. And just out of interest, what was the food like in pre-war Manila? Was it delicious Filipino stuff, or did you get American?
Everything that you could think of.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my parents entertained an awful lot too. My mother was very keen on it.
Very good at it.
Yes.
Yeah. So, tell me, you mentioned Pearl Harbor. Did you hear that? You mentioned your father listening to the wireless. Do you yourself remember hearing about Pearl Harbor? Was it
I think not through the radio. I think it was more through my parents talking about it.
Was there a sort of panic? I mean, was it sort of...
No, I don't remember it being panicky until they started, because it was very soon after Pearl Harbor that they started bombing Manila.
The day after.
It was the day after.
Yes.
They started bombing Manila.
Yes.
Yes.
But I was looking up, and it wasn't until March that we were actually taken in.
Okay.
So
you had a few
and
months.
we didn't know where we were going. I didn't know where we were going. And I can't remember whether we got on a bus or on the back of a lorry, because they were getting people from all directions.
Yeah.
And
Darling, interrupting you, it was actually January that you were taken into the camp.
well, I was reading somewhere
Darling,
else.
darling.
Yes, but that's my mother's
No,
recollection of it.
It's specific.
January the 5th.
You were liberated in February.
February the
February
3rd.
the 3rd.
Liberated by General MacArthur, USA. Is this you?
This is me
Really?
when we got back to Australia, and that was in March.
Aged 10 and a half years.
Yes.
That flag is a bit of a puzzle. It is the Australian Merchant Navy flag.
Okay.
Which Julienne's father kept with them in the camp.
The very flag.
The very flag. Where
During
he kept
the-
it, I do not know.
During the 3 years of their incarceration.
Crikey.
He would have been
and that
shot
was an
if-
extremely risky thing to do, of
Yeah.
course, because had it been discovered, it was as toxic to the Japanese as the radios were in the camp, of course.
Contraband extraordinaire.
Yes.
I mean, yeah. Did your father had connections to the Australian Merchant Navy?
No,
This
he
is the
didn't.
puzzle,
I
yeah.
don't know. I may have known at the time, but I can't remember where he got it. But he kept it concealed the whole time. And this doll is one that I've had from pre-war days, and puppy dog, and he had a zipper in his back because it was supposed to be a pajama thing.
Oh, okay.
But my mother put all her silver jewellery, and not jewellery, cutlery and jewellery into it.
Yeah.
And a child carrying something like that, they didn't know.
Yeah.
And so he was quite precious all through the
Well, he kept the contents for the duration of the war.
I have spoons here that my mother had made, especially in Baguio, where they did a lot of silver work, and they were in there.
He kept his
So
secret.
they survived, yes.
Yeah,
The spoons survived the war.
So, going back to your memories of having the Wizard of Oz read to you in the cupboard under the stairs.
And we were taken into the camp, and nobody knew what to do with us. People milled around the whole time, looking for somewhere to sit down or lie down, and I can remember waiting in the sort of covered area of a patio in the middle of Santo Tomas building, the main university building. There were two patios on either side of the big tower, and just sitting on the floor with our backs to the classrooms, just sort of waiting to see, well, what's going to happen to us, sort of thing. And then I don't know what the time was, but we was billeted in what they call the annex, which was another building on the other side of the main building, and women with children under a certain age were put into most of the rooms. And we were there for quite some time until they opened up another similar building opposite, which had been used as an isolation ward for anybody who was sick. And I was in there with measles.
Measles.
Yes, they made it into a sort of clinic for me. Just
out of interest, I'm wondering about the transformation of your life and how quickly it was just, I mean, how quickly it became almost untenably different. Do you remember the first time you saw a Japanese uniform? There wasn't a moment when...
I think the first time must have been when we had roll call every morning and sometimes in the afternoon, and they would come by a long line of people waiting, and if the tally didn't come to what they think it should have been, we had to wait and wait and wait and be recounted umpteen times and sort of bow as they passed us, that sort of thing.
You'd be forced to
We were expected to
submit I just say to sort of yield a bow, a sort of a show of respect to the Japanese guards.
Yes. But the commandant and his staff were at the front gate, and only a few of the internees were involved with. Most of us just kept away from that area. But there was one man who became very ostracized and disliked by most people in the camp because he was there the whole time with the Japanese. He was English and he spoke Japanese, so he was the official
sort of interpreter.
And we found out after the war that he was in fact an intelligence man who had been a missionary in Japan and learnt Japanese fluently, but took over the role of knowing what was going on in the actual headquarters of the camp.
I see.
And it was he that got the message through to MacArthur's troops that the men would be annihilated.
Right. So all the time, he was sort of the whole dishonouring his fellow countrymen and seemingly betraying his country.
What was interpreted.
Everyone thought, and he was ostracised because of that. But all the time he was
working
diligently working
yes.
in favour of.
And we realised later, or heard later, that the various people that managed to get over the wall and disappear were actually helped by him.
This is Mr. Ernest Stanley, is that
Stanley,
correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw in your grandson's film again. So that's a sort of brief portrait of life in the camp, but you mentioned you had measles. The Japanese, who treated that? Was that?
No, they were all internees.
They were internees.
Doctors, nurses, everybody. I mean, my mother, who was not a nurse, volunteered to look after different people.
Did the Japanese provide medicine? Did they provided all
Red Cross.
The Red Cross.
Yes.
When it got through.
When it got through, yes. Because my mother dealt with the Red Cross, probably for that reason, but through them she got calcium to, and this I can't understand how, but calcium in the form of injections for me,
right,
as well as supply of dried milk. And when all that ran out and my mother couldn't give me any more blood, any more injections, she asked if they would give me infusions of her blood.
Your mother volunteered to have
volunteered to do that, but
Great.
when she was obviously getting weaker, and that had to stop.
I think it's well worth here, darling, quoting from your mother's letter, dated 9th of March 1945, written on American Red Cross paper following their liberation. She said, inter alia, with every available money Frank and I could get hold of, we bought up milk and were able to give Julie 1 cup a day for a long while. Also, we procured calcium to be injected into her. At one time, I was giving 10 centilitres of my blood until it was taking too much out of me. So, in these ways, we were able to keep Julie fairly well. All she had was measles, and they seemed to do her good.
So, the sort of sanitary conditions were such that measles did you good, and you were only kept alive really by the fortitude of your parents, I suppose.
Yes.
Especially given that if I've understood this correctly, the Japanese didn't necessarily willingly surrender medical supplies, which would probably be better used for them on the front line or wherever else they needed it.
No.
It's kind of, I'm sorry, it's slightly unfathomable for someone like me who's grown up with a very, 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 well, no hardship whatsoever, to sort of fathom parents being willing to give so much in such adverse conditions to keep their daughter. You didn't have brothers and sisters,
No.
did you? So you're
the only one.
And you were how old? 7 at this point.
No, yes, it was.
Yes.
I was.
About 7.
At 7.
And this isolation block, were there lots of children in there? Was it?
Yes.
It was the
It was
hospital.
essentially for the children.
Okay.
Yes.
I think it's also worth saying there were 4,000 or about 4,000 internees in this space. I mean, a huge number of people, including a great number of children as well. I mean, the logistics of it all are quite extraordinary because the camp, in fact, ran itself.
Yes.
Had to run itself. Faute de mieux, because the Japanese really didn't care. All the Japanese were concerned with was keeping everybody locked up and deprived of the sorts of things that keep body and soul together. I mean, from what I've read, you had this extraordinary community feeling coming to the surface within this community, which comprised, as you said, doctors, professors, teachers, engineers, people with considerable skills, all of which were put together within the camp and within the camp infrastructure to improve as best they could the life of the internees. I mean, the camp was run as
like a business, really.
As a business, yes. It had a committee. It had its own prison, its own jail.
It was a prison
for people, because of course within conditions like that, you see, as Dickens once said, you see the best of things and the worst of things, and of course, there were people who took advantage and broke the code of civilized living, and were duly, when they were found out, were duly sentenced to be put in a prison within a prison.
By the committee of
the committee.
And that's for stealing or for taking too much food or something like this, overeating rations or something, I suppose.
It was generally that sort of thing.
Right.
Yes.
Good grief. And just since we're sort of on the morale of the camp, was it high at the beginning of the war and sort of gradually decreased, or did it remain fairly? Because
you had pockets of it, really, because there were entertainers, nightclub entertainers.
Yeah.
So they'd put on shows.
Of course there were.
Yes,
Yeah.
they'd put on shows and they'd have choirs, and I was at a dancing school with other little girls of my own age, and we'd appear on stage occasionally, run by a woman who had been a dancer and taught it.
Yeah.
But they're all sort of pockets of this sort of thing.
You mentioned school there. Were you, as a 7-year-old, was there any way that you could continue your education?
It started with the teachers that were in the camp as well. But in the end, well, to begin with, we weren't allowed geography or history to be taught because the Japanese thought it might,
inspire
indoctrinate
the
us or
rebels,
something
right?
like that.
Okay,
But it just got that people didn't really absorb things as they, and it sort of started off, but it didn't take off on a regular basis. And I learnt my times table from my father rather than a teacher. Although we did have teachers, and it was a university building with a lovely library and everything, but people just couldn't put their mind to it.
And that's presumably because the lack of food and the lack of sport and that sort of thing, the sort of basic things that keep people
getting on with life
energized.
as it was.
You mentioned, I know a very specific question, but was there ample reading material? The books in the library were still there?
Yes, they were.
And the Japanese didn't touch them?
No, not that I know.
No. And what about paper? What about exercise books and pencils? And
very short.
Make life incredibly difficult if you're trying to continue.
There was contact in the early years, wasn't there, between Filipinos, particularly, who were outside the camp and who perhaps worked as domestic servants for the internees before incarceration. And so there was a sort of traffic, so to speak, of various things over the fence in the early stages of the life of Santo Tomas. But I'm presuming that as time went on, that really came to an end. And, as the will of the people began to sort of decline simply because of lack of all the things that keep the body and soul together, this sort of general lethargy began to sort of sit within the community. And certainly from the books that we've read, this was very evident that as time went on, the sort of enthusiasm that had been evident at the beginning of their incarceration to get things done, let's all get together and do this, that and the other, and let's set up this and set up that and set up the other. This began to sort of wane as time went on, and you got the sort of situation that Julienne has just described, where there was simply a lack of will. The lack of food had its inevitable effect, and lethargy sort of took over.
Just because it seems to be the driving, the lack of food. What were camp rations like? What was the daily?
Well, in ingredients, initially, the warehouses in Manila were sort of emptied out gradually by supplying us, probably through the Red Cross. And initially we had noodles and prunes.
Noodles and prunes.
Noodles and prunes, because there were lots of noodles around, lots of prunes. And it was, if you used to pretty good food, it was disgusting. And you didn't feel like eating it, but you had to, because there wasn't anything else. But slowly but surely, the land that was not, it was part of the actual Santo Tomas, people started having allotments, and they would grow some vegetables and things like that, which augmented that. But as long as there was a bit of a supply of food outside, it came into us, but you had to feed 4,000 people on this, and the actual quantities weren't enough, so it was more and more like a soup. just
A watery...
a watery soup with a few things floating around in it. And it really wasn't enough to sort of sustain people. My father had, and I think I told you that in the film, he used to go and help offload the bags of rice that came in. And he'd wear his boots with the laces very sort of loose around. And any rice that happened to fall into his boots, he kept, and we would have it. The rice just became a gruel after a while. And then towards probably the last year, there was a revolting little sort of salted fish that they were able to get, whether it was typical Japanese food or not, I'm not quite sure, but that was rather revolting as well. But there were 3 different comfort kits that were allowed in. The first one was the Canadian, and the second one was the South African, and that was through the Red Cross. And they were quite small boxes, but filled with rather large tins of things.
Right.
So we got together with other people and we'd say, let's open a tin of Spam or something like that. And you'd sort of cut it up into portions so as to conserve so that people could share in whatever thing that you were offering them. Or they had a bartering stall where you could go and say, well, I don't need these cigarettes or whatever, jams.
Yeah.
I'll trade it for butter or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the third one was a huge American one. The box was like this. And it was full of small tins of things. So that was really quite a saviour.
Quite.
Yes, it was amazing. And they even had cigarettes in it, which my parents were not smokers, and they bartered it for other things.
Did someone stockpile all these sort of little boxes of, like manna from heaven? Did they sort of stockpile them and distribute them regularly, or were they sort of given out by the Japanese?
They were given out, or the Japanese accepted them, but apparently there were a lot more found in Manila that had been sent out but never ever
and then
brought in.
Stolen, presumably.
Yes.
By either by Japanese or by locals who
could be.
Do you have any? Well, I've got a couple of questions. Could you see from your so first things, the setup of Santo Tomas, the university? There was obviously a main university building. And then how did they construct a camp around that? Did they spread out a little compound beneath
there
it?
was the main building. They had an education building, which had its own history later on, before our liberation. And then there were 2 annex buildings. One was where where my mother and I were put into initially, and for a small time during it, must have been when I had measles, part of it, I think, became an isolation hospital.
There must have been a wall around the complex.
Oh, Santo Tomas?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Great long.
So there was a brick wall already in existence, was there?
A very high wall, yes.
Yes.
So it's not the sort of thing you can jump over.
No. And barbed wire, presumably.
Yes, I think there must have been, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. There was a back entrance and the main entrance. And part of it must have been where the Benedict monks lived. And after we were taken from the annex to the isolation ward where we lived for a while. We were eventually put into room 50 on the 3rd floor of the main building, and if we looked out the windows, we could see the monks in their particular
Really?
building. Yes.
And they're allowed to just carry on, were they?
Yes, they were apart from us, except for a little garden, which was rather a lovely place to just sit and talk and yes. But the rest of the actual land was eventually taken up by the overflow of people who couldn't be billeted in all the rooms of the buildings of Santo Tomas. They were allowed to have shacks, and they built shacks, and eventually, first of all, they said that people weren't allowed to sleep in them. And eventually they got so many people in the camp that they allowed families to live together in the actual shacks that were built.
Right.
And my father helped build a lot of those shacks, and he was especially good at doing what they call nipa roofs.
Right.
And it's palm leaves, I think they are, that are put onto, like, made into a tile by being tied on with a raffia type thing on a bamboo stick, and each one is put in one after the other until you get a thatch. And
Right.
used to do those.
Being a civil engineer, you'd be quite valuable then. Useful man to have on your side.
Yes.
In a spot where
And
you have to build your own.
He was also on the electrical staff because everybody had their job to do.
Right.
And one of the treats was that when they were making the wafers for the Catholic nuns, they had a machine for making them, and I used to watch them and get a wafer every now and then.
No, really, yeah. No, yeah. And those wafers aren't. Yeah, it was
Not exactly.
No,
fitting.
exactly. It's not
Pretty well
exactly.
told,
It's not exactly Christmas, is it? But, so you know, schools, various bits of entertainment, a camp council. I'm wondering now if you could see from the camp. Obviously there was a wall. Did you ever get a sense of what life was like going on outside Manila? There were no tantalising, glistening lights in the distance, which.
No, Bob mentioned the camp that people would come and throw things over the wall to. Well, it actually wasn't a wall. It must have been slightly inside the camp because it was like a wired fence, and our houseboy was asked by my parents, because you could sort of shout to them, if he could get our mattress.
This was
double
at the
mattress
beginning.
at the beginning, and he did, and we went down on various days hoping it would come in, and then suddenly this mattress came over the fire, and somebody grabbed it, and I said, "That's our mattress, isn't it?" And so my mother and father ran off and said,
Yeah.
"No,
That's
that's
ours."
ours."
Yeah.
And we had it for the rest of the time, and my father made a wooden platform for it so it wouldn't be on the floor, which it was for a little while. And things were sort of stowed underneath. But there were 3 different rooms that we lived in, and my mother was a monitor of each room, elected by the inmates, sort of thing, so that if anything was needed, she would have to go to the camp committee, and I imagine they had committee meetings to see how people were getting on.
And just where would your father get materials and tools to build this sort of thing? Would there be wood salvaged from around the university, or was it?
That's quite something, because unless, of course, he was with this electrical gang, and they had all sorts of tools in there, and you wonder how much was available as the university. Whether they had an area that they used to use to do the odd work on rooms or gardens or whatever. It never really occurred to me. I used to spend quite a lot of time there.
I mean, I sort of wonder, presumably useless things like I don't know, desks probably didn't need writing on because you didn't have any paper or pens. You might have broken that up and
could well have been, because they built outside areas where we could go and sit with our plate of mush or whatever it was.
Plate of mush, yeah. I'm wondering about your relationship, the prisoners' relationships with the guards, and whether there was how fiery was it? Was it fiery? Did you have a good relationship with the guards? Were they friendly at all? Did they?
We had as little contact as possible.
Mm-hmm.
The only time I remember seeing them is when they were taking roll call.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't go near the front gate after that initial internment, and I think there obviously were guards at the back gate, but I never went near them at all. But reading different books, a lot of children had a lot of fun going to see them at the front gate and being, I imagine there were some soldiers that had families and liked little children to be around them, etc., etc. But no, I was never
aiming to steer clear. These guards would I mean, I'm sort of wondering more now about you mentioned in your grandson's film escape attempts. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? How did those come about? As from your eyes as a 7-year-old girl, how?
I think I sort of vaguely heard of it just through parents talking about it to their friends, but initially 3 men went over the wall, but they were caught and they were dispatched very quickly. But it wasn't until the last, when the Americans were in the Philippines, that the news of what was going to happen to us got back. It was through Ernest Stanley, allowing or facilitating.
I think it was made abundantly clear to to the internees that the Japanese would not brook any attempts at escape, and that anybody who attempted to escape would be severely punished. And that, I mean, they were true to their word in that sense. And other infractions against the Japanese rule was punished. I mean, by asking or getting people to stand in the sun, for example. I mean, which, given the sort
weakness,
of the temperatures in Manila, I mean, it was a frightful punishment, and I suspect a lot of people suffered from that. But it wasn't until the time of liberation approached that one of the worst crimes was committed by the Japanese, and that was when three American members of the committee simply disappeared one day. And nobody knew what had happened to them until after liberation and the camp was pacified, when their graves were discovered outside or in an area outside of the camp. And no explanation has ever been given as to why those three particular Americans were singled out as they were. I can't think, there were certainly, as you say, my love, there were certainly escapes in the early part of the war.
And at the end of it, when they actually got away with it.
There were some who managed to escape.
Yes, but I think perhaps he was put in touch with the Filipino
the guerrillas,
who alerted MacArthur.
There was one particular sadistic Japanese officer whose name was Abiko, who was universally hated by the internees for his attitude towards them and the sort of beatings that he would administer. And I think it's worth saying also at this stage that a lot was dependent upon the Japanese commandant of the camp as to how the internees were treated and the amount of food that was allowed to be sort of issued to the internees. I mean, from your own account, my love, you said that there were some were reasonably humane, others were not. And it was that, those differences in personality and attitude which affected enormously the welfare of the internees. Abiko was one of those who was not at all well disposed to the internees. And in fact, when the American First Cavalry arrived and burst into the camp, he had a grenade which he tried to throw at American troops, who promptly shot him before he was able to sort of throw his grenade.
That was after the siege of the education building, wasn't it?
Yes. And it's an indication of human nature that as this sadistic Japanese officer lay quite severely wounded, several of the internees set about him and stabbed him and mutilated him, I suppose. And he died from his wounds. But that was the sort of reaction on the part of some of the internees to a man who had made their lives pretty miserable.
And it depended too upon those who had been shell-shocked during the war outside.
The Japanese.
They would come in as a commandant, and he would have much more severe attitude towards us.
Because he'd been affected.
And being shell-shocked as well didn't help.
Sort of a bit, affected by the war, and so made you suffer for it.
Depend very much on which Japanese commandant we had, whether things were good or bad or indifferent. different.
Yeah. I was listening to the Knight's interview. Not the Knights, sorry, the Stewart's interview.
Were you?
Yeah.
Yes.
And they were saying how towards the end, obviously, when air raids increased, members of the camp who looked up to look at the aeroplanes, American aeroplanes presumably,
Yes. Dogfights.
yeah, were made to stand by the front gate for 24 hours without food or water, obviously.
In the sun.
In the sun.
Yeah.
Children, obviously, as well. Just for the sort of supposedly subversing, subversively damaging the supposed impetus of the Japanese.
But
I knew that it was...
You did this, your father did this.
My father used to take me up to his third floor billet room, and we'd sit on the floor and look up and watch the dog fights going on.
And, you know...
Nobody could see us from down below.
Cheering all the way. Do you remember the first sort of appearances of American aeroplanes?
Yes.
Or
It's
tell me about it.
it was the sort of thing that the actual moment went around the camp immediately, because you could hear the difference of the engine of the plane flying over. And one of them, I forget how close it was to our actual liberation, but he dropped a goggle.
A set of his
saying,
goggle,
all your Christmases will come as one.
Really?
In it, yes. And that went round the
That must have been
immediately.
Good grief.
It gave us hope after years of not knowing what was happening. And, the actual fighting didn't go on until fairly close to when we were actually liberated, because it was all up in the north of Luzon. But initially they took Leyte first, the Americans, and it started from the lower islands and worked their way up until they got this message through Ernest Stanley that the men would be annihilated on the 3rd of February, and women and children would be sort of, taken in. And it was then that MacArthur, I think by that time he was deciding to go to the north of the island and come down to us. And when he heard through the people that actually got the message through him, probably through the Filipinos, that this was going to happen. And so they came straight down, made a race of it.
I think MacArthur, didn't he, because he'd suffered the humiliation of having to give up the Philippines.
Yes, it was very dear to his heart.
He vowed to return, didn't he?
Yes,
he said,
did.
"I will be back."
Yes.
And
I shall return.
And
shall
made
return.
straight for
the
Manila and the camp, of course.
The campus,
I mean, and this of course was because the majority of the internees were American citizens.
Yeah.
And MacArthur's stated priority was to get to Santo Tomas and to liberate the internees. I really don't know, what the percentage was between, the American internees and the others, but the Americans far outnumbered every other nationality in the camp, British, Australian, and so on and so forth. But his...
I think that book over there is the one that, you see pages and pages of Americans, and then suddenly it goes through to other
other nationalities, and
yes,
the sort of the waste and stray is the
Dutch and French and
of course
allies.
yeah
Anybody who was ally.
And I think MacArthur, I mean, he's a very, very interesting man.
oh yeah
And you know, if you see the archive footage of the MacArthur accepting the Japanese capitulation on the USS, whatever the ship was.
right.
Arizona?
Was it the Arizona?
I'm not actually too sure. I think the Arizona might have been the one that was sunk in Pearl Harbor there.
Anyway, it was a big American cruiser or battleship.
A huge battleship, yeah.
MacArthur is there, looking like an extremely well-fed man, which of course he was. Also alongside him is General Wainwright, who was left by MacArthur in charge when MacArthur was, according to the order that he was given by Roosevelt to leave the Philippine Islands. He left the United States forces under the command of General Wainwright, and on the USS, whatever the ship was, Wainwright is standing there, a thin beanpole of a man next to MacArthur, and I think MacArthur must have felt exceedingly guilty.
Yeah, incredibly embarrassed.
I mean, he said that he was obeying a presidential order, and which of course was quite correct. He was. I mean, Roosevelt told him to get out, and he was taken out and shipped down to Australia. But it must have lingered in his mind as to whether he'd done the right thing or not. I mean, I think there were one or two sort of songs written about, what was it? There was one, Dugout Doug, I think one was called. But he vowed to return, and, excuse me, I mean, it was thanks to him, because of course there was this huge American debate as to which way to proceed northwards from Australia in order to take on and defeat the Japanese. It was the Navy, the American Navy on one hand, who wanted to bypass the Philippines completely, because if you look at the map of the Far East, the Pacific area, it would make, if you were going to attack Japan, it would make common sense to bypass the Philippine Islands.
Yeah.
MacArthur said, no, I've given the people of the Philippine Islands my promise that I shall return, and he was able to persuade Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, that he really did need to go back through the Philippines. Nimitz would take on the sea route, so to speak, going via the islands, in the Pacific Islands, Guadalcanal and so on and so forth, Iwo Jima and so on, where the Marines would take the brunt of the action, whereas the U.S. Army under MacArthur would invade the Philippine Islands.
The Philippines. And do you remember hearing about the landings of American troops on the Philippines, or was it very hushed?
No.
Yeah.
We weren't aware of where they were until we had the planes.
And you heard the aeroplanes,
yes.
and presumably also started hearing gunfire as well.
That was literally days,
Before,
a day or two before
they
they actually came straight in to the camp, because they fought their way down and went straight into the camp. And then they had to contend with the Japanese bombing the camp or shelling the camp from Manila, and eventually when Manila, they started trying to get the Japanese out of Manila, but Manila had a very ancient walled city, and the Japanese entrenched themselves in that in such a way that it took a long time to get rid of them.
So, far from, whilst, you know, Santo Tomas was liberated. We'll get on to the sort of the actual events of liberation in a second, but that was far from over. The war raged on in Manila.
Yes, but there was one time, very soon after they had come in to liberate us, that the Japanese were shelling the camp, and that particular corner of the main building got the full shells onto it, and a lot of the internees had thought, oh, I must go back and get my belongings from under the bed or whatever, and they were killed. Because of the shelling. And it wasn't until somebody or other went to that area and said, I think it's coming from that church there. And that's where they got them. They had installed
a field gun in the church.
In the church, and we're getting it. But that was a sort of aftermath that took place.
Yeah. Just before I ask you about the day of liberation and you know, what happened, I want to ask a very general question. What, in your eyes, I'm sure this would differ for everyone, maybe it wouldn't, what was the worst thing about being incarcerated in Santo Tomas Internment camp?
Quite a question, that, because as a child you just accept what happens
exactly.
around you, you know.
Which is why it's so difficult to fathom. I mean, if your life could have been incredibly different.
It could have been, because my father had gone into stages of beriberi, and his legs were beginning to swell.
Right.
But he was a skeleton. But I think that both my parents protected me from the evils of everything. Yes. No, I sort of took things as they came, more than being terribly worried about them.
No, good. Yeah, no, I see. That's a good answer. I think, it's just an incredibly difficult thing to fathom. How hugely a young child's life like that would be affected by. But I suppose
think the parents did try and sort of lighten up the situation, because I can remember Halloween being celebrated,
right,
and my mother devised a black witch's hat for me and for my best friend, and built noses out of pink socks so that we could tie them on and have this sort of thing. And we were delighted with them and went out to join the other children who were in various quarters, and they all gathered around us and tried to, get at us and make us perform like a wicked witch. But the two of us sort of shied up, clung to each other, and almost started to cry because of all this mob.
The attention.
Yes, we weren't very good. But there was always something like that was planned by parents to lighten up the atmosphere and keep it as normal as possible for children.
Just while I'm on it, I mean, you've mentioned Halloween. Christmas and birthdays, what would happen?
I've got a picture here Where is it?
Sorry.
Must be in here. Over here.
Sorry.
This is one of the things that my mother made.
This.
That's Raggedy Ann.
Raggedy Ann.
And if you're an American, you know exactly who Raggedy Ann was. But she made it out of all sorts of different bits of material, and my father made her little bucket.
So it's a little sort of rag doll.
Yes, and she's her name is Goldie Tomas, and that was made.
Oh, good
Goldie
grief.
Tomas, and my father made the chair.
The chair and
And-
I'm sorry.
No, and
and all the little hats and
yes, all her little clothes, and
room Santo Tomas Annex, room 74 internment camp. That's her jacket says that.
yes,
And-
and everybody, all the ladies used to have their friends sign, and they embroidered their names.
Right.
And thinking, well, we're going to get out next month, so I'll
It'd be nice to
remember
have
you.
a memory.
Yes.
Yeah. Look at that.
Our middle daughter has this in a little
Do you also,
glass
darling,
case.
what is in the feet?
Oh yes, in her feet are pieces of shrapnel.
Good grief.
Yes.
So this must have been. So that must have
That-
come from an air raid or something. The
Yes,
shrapnel.
yes. I think that was probably the last one that before Christmas or something. That yes.
What you also should make mention of, my love, is the fact that Julienne's father, being an engineer, was very skillful with his hands. And he took the handle of a toothbrush, a plastic handle of a toothbrush, and cut it into pieces and tongued and grooved each piece and made a bracelet out of the handle of this toothbrush.
No.
He threaded
Like that.
wire or elastic through these pieces of. I mean, it must have taken him an
That's
age to do this.
especially without the proper no
but
vices or anything.
I mean,
But
there
he
were.
was an engineer, and they had this electrical shop,
Ah,
so
okay,
they had
yeah.
things to do it with. But
But nevertheless, I mean, unfortunately, it's gone missing, which is a great
having
shame.
three daughters, I think they were
but-
playing
but-
with it or something. and-
Yeah.
I mean, it's an indication of
Just
what the sort of
The
things.
ingenuity
Well, exactly.
is
Exactly, and I mean, it's an ordinary. I mean, to look at it,
yeah.
You-
There's
you
nothing,
really
nothing,
wouldn't sort of-
nothing special.
I mean, there's absolutely nothing special. It's a sort of dark brownish toothbrush handle, but the skill with which it had been tongued and grooved, and then the
Pinioned
together
yes, with a wire.
to provide a bracelet for a little girl as a birthday present or Christmas present
Yeah.
or whatever it was, is an indication of
Another thing he made, and I think Katrina's got it as well, it's a little silver ring. But this was on the ship going back from the Philippines to Australia,
after the war.
yes. And the American sailors, because it was one of the Liberty ships, would do different things on the deck, because it was a metal deck. And my father saw this and decided that he would do something as well. And he made a ring out of a 20 cent Filipino coin. And by tapping it and turning it, it turned it, and then he had it drilled out. But the inside
Good
still
grief.
has the
The
inscription.
inscription.
Yes. And that's
I mean,
another
yeah.
thing that,
Talk
but,
about
for 3 or 4 weeks or whatever it was, on the ship, tap, tap, tapping, and all the sailors doing something similar.
This is quite extraordinary. The unbelievable levels of making do and mending, and it's just so ingenious. It's so, because you just think a little thing like a bracelet, and think what a home comfort that would bring to a man's daughter in such, horrendous conditions. And then to make it out of a toothbrush handle, it's incredibly touching to think about your father thinking, I've got to give my little girl a birthday present. I'm going to make it out of what I've got. And what have I got? I've got a toothbrush. Presumably brushed his teeth for a while, just holding the end of the no handle. But I mean, that it's quite extraordinary to think about.
It is.
So, just one more quick question before we sort of start to talk about liberation. The air raids, were they ever quite frightening? I mean...
No, because, we could see the effect of bombing in Manila, but only from a distance.
Yeah.
So that around us, as the camp, we were aware that the Americans were flying over and bombing, and that there was warfare going on, but it was Manila and probably the harbour and the actual airfield that they were after, rather than
around the civilian. Yeah, okay. So it wasn't like sort of.
And it wasn't until fairly soon before MacArthur came straight in.
Okay.
Because Japs were everywhere when he came in with his tanks.
With his tanks. So you mentioned tanks there. So tell me about the day that you were liberated. Did it begin as a normal day, or was there something in the air?
I think there was probably something in the air, but in the evening there was a lot of sort of flashes of red and yellow and orange. It wasn't a sunset, but we knew something was going on.
It was,
and we could hear gunfire, or and we thought, or at least my parents thought, along with a lot of other adults, that the Filipino guerrillas were going to make themselves felt, and it was them, because we had no sign really, apart from the pilot who threw his message down, that the Americans were that close. So we thought that it was the reaction of Filipino guerrillas, and that what was going to happen if that was the case. But then we realized that something extra was happening, and I remember all the internees were out in the evening, sort of wondering what was happening, and there was a sort of sense of not exactly anxiety, but excitement.
Apprehension.
And excitement. And we started, there must have been some sort of reaction from people who were on the other side of the building, were in front of the gates,
who could
that
see,
something was really happening. And my parents and I were at the back of the building, and we went round sideways to see what was happening, and we saw the silhouette of a huge tank with men on top of them.
GIs
with the helmets on. And of course the inmates were just getting onto the tank and going wild. And that's what I remember the most, that silhouette of that huge tank coming around the corner.
Yeah. And I mean,
And the soldiers came in straight away with them, following the tank. I think there were about 3 tanks that came in the end, or maybe more, I don't know. But they started building foxholes.
And started digging in to protect, because the Japanese were still occupied. Do you remember the... Sorry.
And not only did they do that, but they started handing out all sorts of things like chewing gum and sweets, especially to the children. But they soon set up their canteens, and the first meal we had was turkey fricassee.
Yeah. Must have been...
It was most delicious.
It was the most delicious thing you've ever tasted.
Yes.
And you would the feeling when you saw your sort of an American tank roll through the gate. What was it? It was
just ecstasy.
Stupefying ecstasy.
Yes, people sort of throwing themselves around and jumping up and down and hugging each other and things like that.
Were there tears?
Yes.
A great deal number of tears, I can imagine. I can't imagine. I'm sort of wondering about the effect of being given chocolates and cigarettes and turkey.
A lot had tummy trouble.
I'm sure you had tummy trouble quite badly after that.
Yes.
And then, whilst I find it incredibly moving that American soldiers followed up and immediately started digging in, because there was they specifically made the point of coming to liberate the Santo Tomas Internment camp, and they knew it had to be protected.
They were surrounded by Japanese.
Did you at any point see Japanese soldiers surrendering to?
No. As a child, definitely not. But it all took place at the education building, which was right beside the big building, but in the front, facing the front entrance. And it was a building that single men and boys above, I think it must have been about 12 or 14 years old, were billeted there, and the Japanese went into it and held them as hostages.
The education complex.
Yes, an education building. So that was sort of no-go area for most of the internees. So the Americans didn't want to rush into that building, because they knew that the Japanese would take it out on the internees that they had in the building. So there was quite a lot of negotiation going on with Stanley.
And he was there. He
Yes.
sort of came into his own.
And eventually they decided that they'd have to give up.
The American commander agreed that there should be a ceasefire, and that the Japanese soldiers holed up in this building should be allowed to leave so long as the hostages, the internees, were freed by them. And that was agreed with the Japanese, and the Japanese were marched under American protection out of the camp into Manila. And there is a photograph of Stanley. Where is that photograph?
No, it's not in this book because it's all over.
I think it's...
No, it's not.
I think it's
one of those. Yes.
I think it's in this one.
That book is about all sorts of different places in the Far
And there
East.
was all the other prison
Yes.
camps.
Yeah. And that's a letter.
Frank and Molly Jefferson and their daughter Julie, greeted by a relative after their repatriation from Santo Tomas Internment camp. That's your father there.
Yes.
That's your mother.
And me.
And you with
With
the same doll
the same
in that
doll
and the puppy and the
yes,
puppy there.
Puppy with all the family
Yeah,
jewels in there.
Gosh.
This is the photographs of the.
Thank you.
Here are the Japanese. The Americans are here, of course.
Mm.
This is Stanley here.
Right.
And Santo Tomas is somewhere back here.
Right.
And how far? It's maybe that building there. And they marched the Japanese a certain distance away from Santo Tomas, and thereafter either the Americans shot them or the Filipino guerrillas shot them, but they were dispatched.
Yeah.
And that was that.
Were you frightened about this change of life, or were you just ecstatic again because you're
Exactly.
you're,
No, it
didn't bother you in the
didn't
slightest?
bother. No, no. And as I said, that took place,
Elsewhere.
on the other
So
side
you
of
had
the
no
buildings.
idea about what was.
No, I think perhaps my parents knew through
No.
people talking about it that it was happening, but I was unaware of it.
Do you think? I don't mean to sound, but do you think they minded what happened to the Japanese after everything that you'd been through, after how cruel they'd been? And I don't think.
Not at all.
No, I think feelings
got
would
what
have
they
run
deserved.
very high.
Yeah.
I mean, the huge elation at liberation that sort of ran through the camp, but then you get the reaction, as I described earlier about this Abika. You get that sort of reaction. It's all sort of understandable.
No,
you
totally.
know, somebody who tormented them,
Yeah.
getting their own back. But anyway,
That is what my father built.
He built
for us.
this.
And I drew, but we had this end of it, and we'd stow all sorts of things on a sort of shelf
Yeah.
in between, and then another couple had this
It's
area,
a sort of.
and this was a drain that went through here underneath that
Little bridge.
little bridge, and we would take our rations and have them there.
It's a sort of little.
It's just
I mean,
like
just
a
the
picnic
casual eye,
place.
it's like a sort of picnic area. It's a sort of,
Exactly. But up in here, my parents had one of these bags that they would feed bananas and let them ferment and have banana wine.
oh, really? Okay, fantastic. Did you ever try banana wine? Is it?
No, I
You
wasn't,
weren't allowed.
I
No, fair
wasn't
enough.
allowed at that stage.
And are these coconuts up here?
No, they're papayas.
Papayas.
Mm.
So, were you able to get the fruit for you? I mean, presumably
Yes,
you were able to.
yes. Yes, there were quite a few people who had little plots that they would grow. One ghastly stuff, it was like spinach, but it was very slimy, and it was called talinan. And the camp people grew enough of it to feed people on the chow line. But it was ghastly, slippery
Really?
sort of
stuff.
like a sort of slimy spinach, was it?
Very slimy, yes, but
Yeah.
a spinach type thing.
Was it
and it was supposed to be
talinan?
talinan.
Is that a Filipino thing?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Your mother mentions roots of cannas.
Yes, there's the canna. You know,
It
they come
upset
in
our
different-
tummies, but we had to fill up on something, she wrote. And she also says, we never rummaged in the garbage of the Japanese staff, which suggests that
A lot of people must
some
have.
internees
Some
did.
had, yeah.
Nor did we eat cats, as many of our fellows did. So,
I mean,
If they were around, yes.
I mean, I
Would
suppose.
you like to read that?
Yeah. Right.
It's written, was it in March, before we were, must have been from,
Edward, could I just interrupt?
Yeah, please.
Would you like some sustenance?
Thank you very much. No, that's very kind of you. A glass of water would be lovely.
Well, are you sure? I mean, would you like... I mean, what can we offer? We can offer
a
a
sandwich.
cup of soup and a sandwich or something like that.
That sounds delightful. Thank you very much. If
No. I mean, we
It's what
always
usually
have something.
Well,
I mean, if that's all right.
I'd love to join you.
Well, of course.
I'm sorry. I hate
No.
to take
There's,
up so much of your
you're
time.
not. No,
No.
there's absolutely
Thank
no
you very
problem
much.
on time at
That's
all.
very kind. Thank you very much.
I'll go and do something.
Oh, thank you.
Because it would be a shame to
Yes,
sort of
yes, because it's
I
quite a
would
long
disrupt.
Yeah, it is.
I mean,
quite a
we
long
have
time.
no problem with
Okay,
time.
good. I'm sorry. I know I'm taking it.
No,
I'm
no.
taking
No, you're
much
not.
over.
You're not at all.
Do you mind if I read this out loud for the benefit of the recording?
Do.
This is written on American Red Cross paper. Is that correct? Dated March the 9th, 1945. So it's about a month after you've been liberated.
Yes.
Dearest ones, your concern about us. Actually, what am I doing? Could you read it out, please? I'm sorry, Julienne. I do
That's
it.
all right. Your concern about us warmed our hearts. Thank you for your letter, Isabel. Isabel was my father's cousin. And for you all kindly inviting us to stop a while at Kyneton, that's in their home in Sydney. As we don't yet know our plans, Frank is working harder than ever since the army took over the electrical department, and at night he runs the camp Cine, work that he is most interested in. He seemed to have shaken off his illness and putting on weight. Now, to explain that is that he had almost the last stages of beriberi. His legs were all swollen. We were afraid for him, but although he never did stop working, it was just a matter of time he would have dropped in his tracks. He was skin and bone, legs and face all bloated. Many men of his age died or are still quite ill in hospital. They seem to need more to keep them going during hard manual labor, as they all were, than we women who were also doing hard work under difficult conditions. And at last I was able to crawl around, but felt a warmed up corpus. I work 3 hours every day on camp detail, doing aid work for the isolation hospital until the army took over, besides washing, cleaning, mending old clothes with old material. I learned to knit and made all Frank's socks, knitted him shirts, Julie and myself jumpers, socks, pants. We found that the knitted garments stood up to wear far better than their material. The pants were comfy too, snug, well-fitting, and cute-looking. I'm looking forward to making some in dainty coloured thread, but perhaps you know and have made them already. I doubt it somehow. Maybe you can imagine our heads are still in a whirl. These years have been more tax on us mentally. Ever since we were brought in by the Japs on January the 5th, 1942, we have not had one moment of even an uncomfortable peace. Part of Japanese policy to to harass us, pushing us around from building to building, playing chess with humans. Always there was stupid questionnaires to raise our hopes, only to be dashed. Rumours of relief ships that never came. American soldiers told us that they ran across Red Cross foodstuffs intended for us in captured Jap camps. With every available money Frank and I could get hold of, we bought up milk and were able to give Julie 1 cup a day for quite a long time. Also, we produced calcium to be injected into her. At one time, I was giving 10 cc's of my blood until it was taking too much out of me. So in these ways, we were able to keep Julie fairly well. All she has was measles, and they seem to do her good. We think she is a sweetheart, very like Frank in looks and character, mild and kind. Frank is going to send her to a good art school, for that is her special pleasure to draw. She missed a great deal of schooling, and the intern teachers did their best with little material to work with, a noisy distraction of schoolroom conditions. I have managed to keep Julie fairly respectable looking except for footwear. We tried to keep her in shoes so that her feet would not suffer as she was growing. Frank and I wore native wooden soles with a strap over the toes, or broken down shoes. One pair Frank used to wear with both heels broken away from the uppers. Such tramps we look. His shorts were nothing else but patches. It would amaze you to have seen what we had come to. During the rains, though, is when the camp folk looked most interesting, as we all wore those large native hats like cartwheels, some men even having them tied under their chin with bows of rag. Frank preferred to balance his. Some wore native palm leaf capes that stuck out and looked like bedraggled roosters. One did well to keep one's sense of humour. We were good and hungry, but we never rummaged in the garbage of the Japanese staff, or did we eat cats as many of our fellows did, but we ate roots of cannas, etc. It upset our tummies, but we had to fill up on something. During the last 8 months, we were given only 500 to 1,000 calories a day. Before that, improper diet and not sufficient food to keep us sleeping even. Our Dr. Stevenson was jailed by the Japs for refusing to exclude malnutrition or starvation from death certificates. We can't speak highly enough of the quality and variety of the food that we were given by the American Army, where we were served great chunks of white flesh of turkey, plenty of cream, butter, bacon, bread, and cheese. Americans came in the camp, we will never forget. The night that the Americans came into the camp, we will never forget. The whole lot of us were so thrilled that we were dazed to the danger that we still were under, for Manila was full of millions of Japanese, and the camp was held by 800 Americans. Then came the shelling of the camp for 3 nights. We, among the lot of others, slept out on our chairs or mattresses on the ground in the shelter of the main concrete building. Luckily for us, Japs were only on one side of us. Frank has been looking at the city, or rather where it used to be, old, historic and beautiful new buildings, all a mess. All the beautiful pieces of furniture and art pieces, Frank's camera and really wonderful collection of film, all my treasures in the way of china and crystal were being minded by a third party, but alas, they were on the wrong side of the river and all went up in smoke. So many of our friends have lost their relations or have them in hospital as a result of the hell that was let loose by the Japs in their retreat from the Americans. eventually they did not discriminate women and children. Swiss, Spanish, Germans, everyone met death and a horrible fate for poor women who ever crossed their path. Never will I stop thanking God for our salvation for such horrors just over the river from us. It was a lucky thing, for we were in the camp, that the Americans acted so quickly and successfully on our behalf. It's nice often to think of you all back home in your comfortable houses. We have eaten off tin plate with a teaspoon or a bare board for so long. Julie, I don't think, really remembers the nicety of life. We surely will enjoy everything to the full. She, like I, loves pretty things, and she's crazy about flowers. What fun we shall have doing the shops in a big city. From Manila shops, which you might just remember, are nothing to the big stores at home. Life surely holds many thrills in store for we poor prisoners. Frank will write, I'm sure, but he is busy. His life is still a rush. He and Julian join me in sending you, our family, many remembrances. Molly.
Molly.
Mm.
And that's your mother?
That's my mother. She was Maria Violeta Molly.
Right.
Before she married. Her father was a Peruvian.
Okay.
And he was educated in Australia because his father and a Frenchman left Europe to go to Peru in their lifetime. And they said, no, what was it? No, it must have been their parents. And the families sent my grandfather and this friend to Australia to do their education. And that's where he met my grandmother.
And they shacked up. Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's a wonderful letter, actually, I have to say.
Yes, she was very, very good at writing
It's,
letters. My mother had great practice.
It's just full of optimism.
Atmosphere.
Humanity.
Yes.
It's incredibly striking. So now that I think we're sort of slowly but surely winding down, but
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, do you think about the war often now?
Not often.
No?
No. No, certain things, bring it out, but it's the sort of thing that one of our daughters, our middle daughter, is the one that's most interested in it, and she's the one that has all the various little
The little
things that
trinkets survive.
and the little dolly and things like that. No, we don't talk about it. No.
And I'd sort of, I'm loath to ask this question, but I sort of feel like I sort of have to. What do you think of? Can you conceive thinking about the Japanese now? And do you ever think about them?
It's strange that you should say that, because I've never been drawn to make any friends of Japanese. And because we've travelled around in various places, my husband being in the diplomatic corps, we have had to be diplomats with different countries and different other diplomats. And in Brasilia, the Japanese there, I had a small exhibition of my paintings, and she came along to have a look at them, and it gave me a funny feeling, because in the diplomatic corps, you don't sort of take umbrage with people, but she was quite a sweet little lady, but, if ever I met her, I sort of was polite, but I'd make sure that I moved on.
Yeah, you couldn't.
Yes.
You couldn't get too chummy with them. Or,
No.
I think anyone in their right mind would absolutely sympathise with that sentiment. Just before I ask sort of my final question, could you take me through these photographs here? What's happening?
That is when we came back from the war.
And this is the camp was liberated.
Yes, and we were flown to was it Leyte? Well, down to I think it must have been a Red Cross area, and there I think we were there about 2 weeks before we were loaded onto a Liberty ship for Australia.
Bound for Australia.
Yes, to go back home, and I think it was a holding area for prisoners, because I think the American ships went off from there as well, except that they and the people who were going back to England went across the States, whereas we were taken straight down. And of course MacArthur had his headquarters down there before the invasion of the Filipino areas. So we boarded the ship there and went down, had a refuel at Rabaul, and put off at Townsville, and taken over by the Australians, and loaded onto Queensland's 3-foot gauge trains.
Little railway, yeah.
Which wobbled along all the way down, and everywhere we stopped, the locals brought food to us, mainly tropical fruit, as we were up in northern Queensland. And with the carriages, they had these luggage racks, and we had fruit sort of rumbling around there. And every time we'd stop, there'd be a contingent of locals with tables groaning with food. And so we were just up to our eyeballs in food.
Was it wonderful?
It was wonderful, yes. And when we got to Brisbane, my mother had a cousin who was married there, and she came forward and said, "Come and have lunch with us," because they were going to stay over lunch time period. And then another woman came up and said, "No, she has to come with me because I went to school with her." And so the family was sort of torn apart. And my parents went with the family, and I went with this lady and her young son, who was, and we had our lunch and then boarded the train again, and then we went down to Sydney, and my mother's cousin lived there, and we stopped off with them for a couple of weeks, just to sort of rest and be fed, and before facing my grandparents in Melbourne.
Was that the first time you'd met your grandparents, or was?
Yes.
It was.
Yes, it was, because I left when I was 3.
And what was it like? I mean, was it?
It was rather strange.
Was it? Yeah.
Especially being hugged by an elderly person, smelling of cologne or whatever, and thinking, "Who is this?"
Yeah, certainly not used to that, are we? No. The smell of cologne must have been quite a rarity as well.
But my grandfather was a dear, he really was, and spoke with a slight accent. And my father had learnt a lot of Spanish from him before we went to the Philippines.
Oh, wonderful. That's lovely. So this is the photo of you arriving in Sydney.
Yes, yes.
With your dolly and your puppy.
Mm-hmm.
And that one there?
No, I'm not sure who she is.
Ah, okay.
But this was an autograph book that was started. That's my
Dear little
grandparents.
Julienne, with Grandma's love, wishing you a very happy birthday.
Yes.
September the 17th, 1936.
But now wait a minute, there's one that I thought I'd marked. Because we had a visit in the camp from... That's one of them. Look, that's
Good grief.
my best friend. That was their little shack.
That was their little shanty there.
Mm.
And
That's a canna.
the cannon, yeah.
Mm.
Dear Julie, I shall always remember the happy times we had together in Santo Tomas. Wishing you lots of good luck. Catherine
Elfstrom.
Elfstrom.
Yes. I did correspond with her for quite some time, but things go in different directions as we grew up. But there's another Santo Tomas one, but that's just girly things.
Yeah, no, sort of, yeah.
But this one here, Nessie Doo, she was the one who had the other side of our little shack, and we met up in Brisbane. Because they lived there
Okay.
after the war.
So, room 24 of the main building.
Yes, there's another one. Left STIC on 26. Parents, Jerry Walker. That was an exchange of some sort.
Oh, okay.
They were...
So people were released during that, right?
Yes.
So in room 50 on the 3rd floor.
Mm. Yes, we were all mothers with girls, and my mother was the sort of
head matron, as it were.
Yes.
That's it.
Mm.
I hope that you and I will meet again. Hope you get out of here soon. Your best friend, Jane Walker.
Mm.
Gosh, I mean, it's incredibly raw. I have to say, it's unimaginable.
It
What a
is.
sort
It was. Yes.
Must have been.
Where is it gone? These are all...
All these lovely
Somewhere.
drawings inside of it as well.
Yes, it's goes back a long way. But there's one when the British Army came in and we got there. And I think my mother, there we are, Blamey.
Blamey. Frank Berryman, is that?
Berryman, yes. Simpson, and there, but my mother has explained who they are.
Australian Commander-in-Chiefs to the Australian internees in Santo Tomas Internment Camp. General Sir T.A. Blamey, Commander-in-Chief. Frank Berryman, Chief of Staff. C.H. Simpson, Signals Officer. Lieutenant Colonel J.B. Gregory, USA, Camp Commandant. Look at that.
Mm.
So, you proffered the book for signing, did you?
Yes, I think must have been my mother.
And General Blamey
Yes,
penciled it in.
yes, they signed them, and then he...
Good Lord.
Yes. But he must have been put in charge of the camp, if it has...
Yeah. And this is on the 14th of March, 1945. So you were kept in the camp for a good long time after it was...
Yes, a good month before we were repatriated.
Good Lord.
I suppose they had to sort of...
Thank you very much. Yeah, I suppose they had to, maintain the... That's extraordinary. What an amazing memento to have. And just your last question, I might wait for Bob to sit back down, because he might have one or two things to say about the matter. But I wonder, I wonder if you think that your 3 years or so in an internment camp has affected the rest of your life. Do you think it has? Do you? I suppose
It's
waste is something.
Quite a question, that, because I think one lives life when as it comes, and probably being only child, being cosseted and
Oh, sorry.
cared for.
No, it's all right. Let me move it.
Let's see.
Being an only child and being cosseted,
Yes.
you were saying?
Yes, I think that it's different from perhaps people of large families in that they.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I made a
It's
bit
all
of a
right.
mess.
No.
Your life is not so much under your parents,
No.
because we always did things together.
Yes.
And I was obviously protected in that way.
Yeah.
So that, no, I don't think it's affected my life as such. Do you think, Mike?
What's that?
Have I been affected during my life by the
Well, no, I think, the resilience
Yes, quite.
of human beings to
Yeah.
recover.
Yeah.
I think some
thank you.
people were affected. People who've been brutalised or had suffered, personal punishment at the hands of the Japanese. I mean, the Burma Railway and that sort of thing. You couldn't, and yet even people seem to survive, don't they? Get over these setbacks. No, I don't think you've been.
No.
It's just
I think
that
people put things behind them, and I think their parents must have as well, because they never really talked about
Well,
it.
I think this is. I mean, I'm about to get on my hobby horse.
Okay. I'm ready.
No, I mean,
Thank you very much.
do dig in, and then
Thank you.
ham sandwiches. I hope that's going to be all right.
Oh, delish. Thank you so much.
So much, and you as a historian will perhaps agree with me. So much family history is lost
Yeah.
simply because people haven't put down things on paper. Our parents' generation went through extraordinary times. They went through 2 world wars, and sandwiched in the middle was a huge depression, which affected the world. Stock markets crashed and things like that, and yet, they overcame it and lived through it, and but never put anything down. I mean, I don't know about you and your grandparents, but I know so little about my father and my mother. I know something, but not enough as I would wish. And my uncle, my first uncle, was in the First War, and it hurts me now that I never asked him, and he never wrote anything down, and I never asked him about his service in the Great War. And then I have my younger uncles served in the Second War, and they haven't put things down on paper. And you do, and of course, when you're young, except in your case, because you are a historian and these things are perhaps more important, but when you're young, there are all sorts of other things to think about and concern yourself with, rather than sort of family history. Yeah. And it's only in the later years that you begin to focus and kick yourself. You didn't ask the sorts of questions that you should have asked when you were younger, but there you are.
Makes me.
Do help yourself.
Thank you very much. In that case, I'm glad that we've spoken then, and your grandson made the film, and
well, it was only his interest in
it was
filming.
one of his projects.
It was one of his projects when he was at Ealing Studios. that they had to make a 15-minute film of any subject they wished to, do it on, and he thought it would be a good idea to ask his grandmother about her life or her experience, and he very carefully, as you will have realised, he very carefully and intelligently got hold of archive US Army footage.
Yes, that's
which he fed into it, which sort of added to the sort of the sense of the film.
It certainly did.
But it's
it looked very. I mean, it looked entirely professional, I have to say.
well, yeah, I mean, I think he did a good job. Thank you. I hope these are all right.
No, they're delicious.
Good.
I love a good ham sandwich.
But you see, it's a great shame that Julienne's parents didn't put anything down on paper, apart from that letter.
Which is extraordinary, I have to say.
Written fairly soon after liberation. I don't know whether Julienne told you, but the Stuarts, whom we met quite by chance, Jim Stewart, at a party given by my younger brother last Christmas, a drinks party, and Jim Stewart and Julienne happened to be sort of standing talking to each other and said, what have you done? Probing questions, and he said he'd lived in the Far East and the Philippines, at which point Julienne's ears pricked up. And she said, Filipino? Yes. He said, I was very young, but I found myself incarcerated, and so it began. So amazing coincidence.
Bizarre.
So we've, and it was Jim Stewart, of course. This project sort of came about as I understand it. Jim Stewart, he was at Sherborne.
Yes.
And the sort of the seed was sort of planted there, so to speak.
So
is that right?
Michael Thompson, who interviewed the Stewarts, was also at Sherborne.
Ah.
And so was I.
Ah.
And that's how I got in touch. There was the old Sherburnian thing, and there was an advert there asking if anyone knew anyone who could be interviewed. And I thought, well, I've got an interest. I'd love to get involved, and wrote to him, and here we are. And so that's they were both at Sherborne. I don't quite know the starting story of WarGen or how the project began, but from what I understand, it is Michael Thompson's baby.
Is it?
I think.
Jim Stewart mentioned Dan Snow.
Yes, that's the other thing I'm confused about. I've heard James Holland and Dan Snow the sort of talk about it on YouTube and this kind of thing, but I've never.
Yeah.
I haven't heard. I don't know. And obviously they publish stuff. I think they might have sort of started it with. I'm not entirely sure, but I think they might have started it with.
Oh, that's good. I was looking for someone.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much indeed. I think I'll stop the recording there so we can enjoy our lunch. But thank you both very much indeed for speaking about it. Thank you.